Tonight we're going to be jumping into 2 Samuel, and we are in chapters 16, the verse 15 through 1943. So we're going to look at about 3.5 chapters today, and it is a continuing story of David. Last week we saw Absalom begin his revolt and David leave, and so we are going to continue on that trajectory this evening. The story is, if we remember back to why this is all happening, in David's sin with Bathsheba, against the Lord, part of the discipline from the Lord is that the sword will never leave your house. And so that's part of what we see playing out here in the later years of David's life. And so today there's some great tragedy in this story, but we also see David restored back to the throne in tonight's section. So we'll just jump in, verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel. So meanwhile, David's leaving, and so it's going to go, back at the farm, kind of note there. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. So meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king, long live the king." Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with the father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So, hey, good to see you, Linda. So as we are jumping in here, these people, these names, Ahithophel is an important figure in this story because he was an advisor to King David. He was a part of his military structure. He is also Bathsheba's grandfather. So he has some opinions about David. And so sometimes we read these stories and these passages and we forget that there are real people and real relationships involved. And so in this situation, here is one of the advisors who, his granddaughter had her husband die, all very mysteriously. And then just a few months later, David is married to this woman and there's a baby coming. And so, Ahithophel probably has some great suspicion about David. And so when Absalom rises up, Ahithophel is one of the first to join in Absalom's conspiracy. And so here he is giving advice. Now, Hushai, the Archite, if we remember from last week, he was coming out to see David. And David said, "No, go back and be my man on the inside." And so he is here to kind of muddy up the waters for Absalom's revolution. And even in what he says to Absalom is like, his greeting is, "Long live the king, long live the king." So he's still telling the truth. And his response to is this how you serve your friend? And he's like, "Well, I will serve the one the Lord appointed, the one the people chose." And all down these lists, he's not telling any untruth. And then when it says, should I not serve the son? This is the sticky part. Is like, which son are you talking about? Because if we remember, David had a lot of sons. And so Hushai is a spy, but he's also not trying to deceive in these greetings here. But he is saying like, yeah, I'm going to work for you. Sure. But ultimately my authority is coming from David, and he's the rightful king over the people of Israel. And so Absalom welcomes him, and we will see that his advice will be important in Absalom's downfall. So his first thing he says to Ahithophel is like, hey, what should I do? How should I move forward? And Ahithophel says, go and sleep with all of your father's concubines. And these concubines were like secondary tier wives in the ancient world. It is not something that is strictly forbidden in the Old Testament, but is not something that is like, yeah, really great idea. And so it's part of the culture. There were political alliances that were created through these different things. It was all a whole mess. David left these concubines there to care for the palace while he was gone. And so there are these women who are essentially these secondary wives. And when a new king would, in the ancient world, would take over a dynasty, one of the things they would do to like assert themselves is to sleep with any of the surviving wives of the former king. So is it gross? Is it terrible? Yes, absolutely. And this advice here, though, is part of the ramifications of David's sin. Because if we remember, when David was on the roof of the palace, he saw Bathsheba. He inquired about Bathsheba. He had Bathsheba brought to him. All of these things were happening on this roof. And now Absalom is doing another despicable thing on this roof of the palace because he wants to assert power. But it's all coming back to what Nathan said to David, the voice of the Lord saying, like, what you have done in secret, I will bring out into the open. And so this is all part of these ramifications. And Ahithophel's motivation is to say, like, show the people of Israel that you are against your father. And so this is kind of like the bridge that you cannot come back over. And so even if Absalom were to survive the conflict with David, this would have been an unforgivable thing. He would have been exiled for this. And so while David is out of the palace and on the run, Absalom and Ahithophel are trying to build this solidification of Absalom's authority over the people. So that's what's going on there. And even here, as the note says in verse 23, in those days, the advice of Ahithophel was like that of one who inquires of God. That is how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. Like, he was esteemed. And so, Absalom has been working really hard before having himself anointed king when he was in Hebron. He still needs advisors. Like, he's still like nowhere near as experienced as King David, and Ahithophel's been an advisor for a long time. So it's like, yeah, I'll listen to you. I'll go do this thing. And so he does it, and it's awful. Story continues, verse 17. Ahithophel, that's one that is going to trip me up multiple times. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, so it's like, go and just decisive victory right now while David is unorganized. And Absalom's like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let me get a second opinion. So he calls up, summon Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time, which is a bold move here for Hushai to say, the most trusted advisor, no, not this time. You know your father and his men, they are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the troops who follow Absalom, then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like that of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are very brave. So he's selling David here. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, so from north to south, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you with yourself, leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not a pebble, as much as a pebble, is left. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. And so Ahithophel's advice, go and take the initiative in the attack, because David is scattered. His men are not organized. Now's the time that you can go in and take him out and then win everybody back. No, you don't have to go and kill all these other Israelites who are just collateral at that point. They will see, oh, you're the better fighter, right? And so it's such a good idea. But Hushai knows David, because he also is a part of his military retinue. And so he's like, look, remember when we told you stories about your father on the run from Saul and how he hid in caves and was very crafty and very good at surviving? That's what he's going to do to you. Hey, Michael. And so he is telling them, like, your dad is not to be messed with. So you need to get your people together, like get all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, come together. And instead of just sending out a few generals to go and take out David, Absalom, you should go. You should go and lead the nation in this battle so that you can, again, show your power, your influence, your strength. So Ahithophel's previous advice was show your power, your influence, your strength, take your father's concubines. Now Hushai is playing to Absalom's vanity to say, like, oh, wait a minute, so that you can look better. And it works. And Ahithophel, his advice is not taken. So they're going to go with Hushai's plan. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is this image of, like, we will go, and if he goes into a city, we'll tear it down with ropes. And this was something in the ancient world, as I was doing research, like that is something that they would do. They would completely obliterate cities and pull down the walls with ropes and like wipe it out, because it was a way to assert dominance. And so again, Hushai is saying, like, we want to be as overwhelming a force as possible. And so Hushai is giving this advice. And Absalom listens to it. But as we walk through the life of David, one of the things that we should note is God is providentially guiding these conversations as well. And so it says the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So even though the curse on David for his sin was, the sword will never leave your house, your wives will be given to another, what you have done in secret I will bring out into the daylight. All of these things are true, but he is still God's anointed. He is still the king. Now, David is far from perfect, but God keeps his promises. And so David, the Lord is doing all of this because Absalom is not God's anointed. He's God's anointed. He's not the one that God chose to lead the people of Israel. And so this is all part of God's providential hand guiding and directing David's life. This week, I was out on a jog, and I was listening to somebody on a podcast talk about the life of David. And this is a person who's a skeptic and who was looking at David and saying, there's no way that these things could happen. And so it's just one of the many podcasts I listen to. It was just next. And when I'm running, I'm not going to like stop and like, let's listen to something else. I just kind of let it happen as I'm going. And so I was like, man, this guy, why is he even reading the Bible? Because he was taking out the possibility that God could do these things for David, that God could orchestrate somebody's life in such a way that you would look back and say, only by the hand of God could this happen. And so even as I listened to that person and their podcast, and then reading this, it's like, yeah, this seems unusual. This seems improbable, but God does unusual and improbable things all the time. Throughout scripture, throughout history, in our own lives, we could all probably look back and say, if I had followed that person's advice, my life would be a lot different and probably a lot worse. And so there we see God's hand at work. And we should, when we see that happening, we should thank God, like, Lord, thank you for protecting me from taking that job or moving into that neighborhood or dating that person. You know, there's all kinds of things where we say, Lord, thank you for watching out for me. So this is one of those times where we see the Lord had determined to frustrate for David's benefit, even though David, far from perfect. So verse 15, because remember, Hushai is a spy, and that rhymes. So we're in chapter 17, Michael, 2 Samuel. Verse 15, Hushai needs to now get the word out for Absalom's plan. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom to do such and such, or Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such. Now, I love, this is just a pattern in scripture. When something is like, you need to remember exactly these things, it will be repeated. Like Abraham sending the servant to get Isaac, and Isaac and the servant explains what he's doing like 3 times in that chapter. It's like, this is important. And here then we have a different writer in 2 Samuel, right, not doing that method. It's just funny. Like, Ahithophel said such and such, yada, yada, yada. And so like, I love that because it's not super repetitive. So yada, yada, yada. But I have advised them to do so-and-so. So such and such and so-and-so. Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. So that's on the Jordan River. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go in and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. I want to make sure I'm okay. When Absalom men came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered them, they crossed over the brook. The men searched but found no one, so they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown, put his house in order, and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. So the spy network now is put into play. And so there's all these drops and relays that are all in place and I love a good spy movie. And so like reading this, there's like some like intense music. If you've seen Spy Game, like That's what I picture. Like, you got to meet this guy at the cafe and give him this microfiche, whatever. Focus, Jason. So he has to go. Hushai tells Zadok and Abiathar, and those are priests, and then they tell the next generation down to go, and they tell a woman in a town. All of this stuff is part of a way to create plausible deniability with David's men on the inside, because his men on the inside are Hushai and Zadok and Abiathar. Because remember, they came to David as he was leaving saying, "We will follow you," and David sent them all back. And the priests in particular are the ones who are going to be able to inquire of the Lord. They're the ones who are have spoken into David's life in particular ways in the past and been a blessing to him. And so they're very much on David's team, but they can't just go directly to him. So all of this is happening. And even, this woman, like, her plan to cover the well and put grain over the well. So it would look like they're sorting the grain after harvest, kind of thing. Like, it's that sort of thing. And so it probably would have been a lot of grain, not just a little bit, but to like a lot of grain to make it look like there's not even a well there. So so they get out after those folks leave, and they tell David. But the real tragedy here in this story is Ahithophel recognizes that his advice is no longer being listened to. And he is a man of order and reason. And so he goes home and puts his house in order. And then he hangs himself. He takes his life. And one of the interesting things in the Old Testament is we do read about people taking their lives, and we don't get a condemnation from, we believe like you shall not murder, right? You should not take somebody's life. And there's this odd thing in the Old Testament where it's like there's people who take their lives, and the writer never jumps in and says like, what a tragedy. What a shame. And, I am not advocating for suicide. I would never advocate for suicide, just so you know. But one of the challenges as a pastor, when you are asked to do a memorial service for a believer who takes their life, there's a great tension in the service, because they're like, people are like, well, where are they right now? And I can't answer that question. Right? Like, I don't, as a pastor, as believers, like, we don't determine where anybody is when they die. And there are ways that we can like help people process through this and say like, let's just trust the Lord. Let's seek him and receive his peace for our life and our grief right now. But it's a bigger question than just, well, they did this, so they're going to hell, which is kind of how I grew up thinking. And like, we don't get that with Ahithophel here. We don't get the sense that, well, he's going to spend eternity in damnation. That, like, the text doesn't tell us. And even when we read in the New Testament, Judas, he takes his life, and he's a son of perdition, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean that that Judas is spending eternity in hell? I can't answer that. Like, that's a real question that I have as a pastor. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't have an answer for that question. And that's one of the things that sometimes, as people of faith, we have to be willing to say to people, I don't know, and I can't know. Yeah, and the truth is better than just trying to tell somebody something just to sound like we know what we're talking about. And so if you're a part of Creekside, online, in the room, the folks, wherever you're at, spread the word. I will say I don't know to you, like, multiple times, and that's okay. Like, you shouldn't freak out. Like, my pastor said he doesn't know the answer to a question. That's okay. All right, we're going to be all right, because there's so many things we can't know. So, Linda.
1970s, named William A. Nolan, and he went to medical school He did his residency at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. Then he worked as a surgeon in a small farming town. And he wrote the book, The Making of a Surgeon. And then he wrote the book, A Surgeon's World. And then he wrote the book, Surgeon Under the Knife. And then he wrote the book, Men in Midlife Crisis.
Okay.
What he wrote was he was asked to do public speaking. And he wrote that at the end of his speeches, he would ask for questions. And he would either answer the question or he would say, I do not know.
Yeah.
And he was a best-selling author.
Yeah. Well, that's good to be able to say that. One of the things I say when I don't do Q&A, I do Q&R, so question and response, because I have a response. I don't necessarily have an answer. And that's a little better to frame as we go into this. Like, my response could be, I don't know. Let's look into this. So, all right, let's keep going. So Ahithophel takes his life. David crosses the Jordan, and Absalom is gathering his troops, and he's going to lead them into battle. And so that's where we're going to jump in verse 24 through verse 4, it looks like on my notes. So David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa is another one of David's generals. He was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. So he's related to Joab as like a cousin. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Ammiel from Lo Debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelem, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grains, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. The king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and thousands. Verse 5 too. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. So as they are in Mahanaim, these people who are from the nations around and the different regions, they're bringing food and supplies to David's men. And that's something that people love David. Like in the outskirts, people love David. They want to support him. And so here they bring him all of these different things to care for them. But the biggest thing to take away from this is that David is saying to his generals, don't be gentle with Absalom. Even though he is trying to take the throne, and David probably would have heard that Absalom had taken his concubines, that he is doing all of these terrible things. David is still his father. And, all of these things are happening, and David knows this because of David's disobedience, because of his sin. All of this is coming down on him. And there's a part of him that's just like, I don't want my son to suffer. Like I did this, and I should suffer for this. And we'll see that even later in the passage tonight, that David wishes he could trade places with Absalom. But Yeah. So he tells them to be gentle. And they even say, like, he's like, I'm going to go fight with you. And they're like, no, you're not. Remember, Ahithophel's advice was go and get David. And if they see you out there, that's all they're going to care about. Get David. And so stay back here and support us from here. And we will fight for you because you are our king. And so David reluctantly does this and agrees to these conditions. Verse 6. David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There, Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. And so part of where this forest is in particular, we don't really have a good sense because deforestation and growth and development throughout the region and war, like there is no forest like so thick right now in this region. Doesn't mean there couldn't have been back then, but we can't say like this is where this battle happened. This is where Absalom met his demise. But the territory, the terrain is intense. It is difficult. And so the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword does not necessarily mean that there are ants in the forest. So like Lord of the Rings, it doesn't necessarily mean that the trees fought the men. Could it mean that? Maybe, but it's also, they didn't know what they were doing. And they like people trying to run in there with horses and chariots and all these different things. Like they didn't know what they were doing. Whereas David's men had a history of fighting guerrilla style warfare. And they knew like how to use terrain for their advantage. And so David, because of the delay that Hushai made possible, David is able to choose where the battle is going to happen, to put his men in the most advantageous positions possible. And so that's all happening here. And they are starting to overwhelm Absalom's forces. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men in verse 9. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going. Last week, we saw Absalom's hair was like really his pride, and he would cut it and have it weighed, and it was just so beautiful and luxurious. And people were like, man, this guy's hair, I wish I had hair like that. And so the irony here is Absalom in his pride, the very thing that he was so proud of is the thing that gets him caught. Now, there's an application there for all of us. Not necessarily like keep your hair short. I mean, that's not why I keep my hair short. But like where we are most prideful is where we are most vulnerable. And in the text, the word here is his head is stuck. And so it could also just be like he got in a branch and couldn't get himself out. But like, because we know the hair was such a big deal for him, like having his thick hair knotted up in branches is a real possibility. But he's stuck. And the mule, like he's riding a mule because the mule was a sign of the conquering king. Like, I don't need a war horse. I'm just going to come in here on a mule, and I'm an agent bringing peace. And he's stuck in the tree, and his mule just keeps going. Like he is literally stranded by his pride. Verse 10. When one of the men saw what happened, he told Joab, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Which is like, no, you didn't. Prove it. So Joab said to the man who had told him, what, you saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt. So 10 shekels of silver is about a year's wages. I would pay you for a year, and I would give you like an award saying you are a mighty warrior in all of Israel. But the man replied, even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out in my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I had put my life in jeopardy, and nothing is hidden, I can't turn the page. It's stuck. And nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. So it's like, I would have killed him and you would have said, that guy killed him. Like, it wouldn't have been like, he's just following my orders, David. No, he's like, no, that guy killed him. So the soldier's covering his butt right here. Joab said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no sons to carry on the memory of my name. He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So Joab kills Absalom. He is ignoring David's command. Be gentle with him. Now, part of what we learn from Absalom is he is going to do what is most advantageous to bringing peace to the kingdom. So even though Joab is the one who went and got Absalom and brought him back to the king, because he was trying to make peace for the kingdom. And now Joab's like, Absalom's the problem. I brought him back. I can take him out. And so that's what he does. And so he goes, kills it, has him struck down from the tree, and then his armor bearers actually end up finishing the job of killing Absalom. But then when the trumpet is sounded and all of the victory is declared, the people of Israel, it says they all fled back to their homes. So all of Absalom's army basically were like, peace, we're out of here. Because they knew, like, the war's over. Absalom's the guy. The same thing would have happened if David had gone out and they killed David. All of the army of David would have fled away. And so all of Absalom's people take off. And they don't even give him a burial. Ahithophel, when he took his life, he was buried in the tomb of his fathers. Absalom is buried in a hole in a forest. And he wanted the king, he wanted to be the king so badly. But now he's not even buried anywhere in Jerusalem. Yeah.
I have a question. You might have a response, not an answer. But what do you think it means? And this is a question I have. I don't have the answer really. I can think about what the answer might be, but I don't have the answer. What does it mean when Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead?
That is a lot bigger than what we have time for tonight. So I'm not going to be able to answer that question tonight.
Some people are getting older, they might get sick,
Yeah.
they might be considered dead. What should we do with them? That's a big question.
Yeah. And that's not going to be part of tonight's conversation. I'm sorry, Linda. So it's a good question. Sure. Yeah. So David, Absalom is buried in a pit, but then we also get this side here that says, during his lifetime, he built a monument for himself. Like saying, like, I don't even have any sons. But earlier we read that Absalom had 3 sons. And so these 3 sons, they must have died at some point. And so he's like, I don't have a legacy for myself, so I'm going to build a monument. And that's all that really survives for Absalom. We don't know where he was buried. We don't know, like, he's just buried in a pit. And so verse 19, now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said to Joab, let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of the enemies. You are not the one to take the news today, Joab told him. You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today because the king's son is dead. Now Joab knows the last time somebody came and brought news to David that somebody, like his enemy, was dead, David had that person executed. Like, Joab knows this. And so he's like, no, Ahimaaz, you should not be the one to do that, because that's taking your own life into your hand. So instead, Joab said to a Cushite, an unnamed Cushite, a person, not an Israelite, just an unnamed person, go tell the king that what you have seen. The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, now just FYI, that should never be on like a track person's like verse on their shoes. All right, come what may, I want to run. Like people do that kind of stuff. They take a verse and they say, "Yeah, that's my life verse." No, don't do that one. Sorry. So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. When David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway of the walls. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he is alone, he must have good news." And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner and called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man is running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." The king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion, just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was." So Ahimaaz is hedging his bets. He's not telling a whole truth here. So there was a lot of confusion when I left, and maybe there was, but he knows what happened. The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of the Lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom. If only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So Ahimaaz saw great confusion. I don't know really what was happening. And the Cushite is saying, "You have been delivered from your enemies." And he never says Absalom's dead, but he does say, he gives him the code basically to say, "I hope all of your enemies suffer the same fate that Absalom has suffered." And that's enough for David to recognize that my son is dead. And so this is where we see he's wanting to trade his own place with Absalom because he is grieving that his son is dead. So this is like this story like moves, and we can get into some details, but it is a story. I don't want to lose momentum in the story. So this is all happening on the east side of the Jordan River. So in the Trans-Jordan is what they would call it. And over there, it's there's a barrier of the river between there and Jerusalem. And so as we move into chapter 19, there's going to be this journey of restoration for David. But everything David's doing, like starting out on the east side of the river. That's important to note because he's mourning over there and he's waiting for a next step, but his grief is keeping him from actually taking a next step. And so Joab, who not a great dude, but also is trying to build some stability in the kingdom. That's one of the ways that we need to read Joab's actions in these chapters is he does want peace. Because a man of war really wants to have a day where there is no more war. And that's part of Joab's life. But he also knows the cost of peace in his mind is, people die. And so he's kind of cutthroat and heartless, but also he does want stability. So it doesn't mean be like Joab. Please don't hear that today. Don't be like Joab. But I just want to get into his mind, his motivations a bit. Joab was told, "The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day, the troops heard it. The king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So instead of having a victor's parade, they come in just like, can you believe what we had to do today? And like that in Joab's mind is embarrassing to soldiers. Like, you sent them out there, like, welcome them back as victors, but they're coming in grief themselves. Then Joab went into the house of the king. This is bold, to go into where the king is living and just start making demands. Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and reminding him, you have more children than Absalom. They were all in danger because of Absalom and what he was doing. Your wives and concubines, you love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now. So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When all the men were told, the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites, the Absalom's army, have fled to their homes. So yeah, Joab is just calling it like it is. Like, get out there, encourage your men. They took their lives into their hands for you. So the least you can do is stop crying over your enemy, because this is war and this is where we're at. So David takes this advice and he goes out and greets his soldiers. Verse 9. Throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, the king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, who we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? And so the men of Israel are like, hey, are we going to have a king or what? Like, he defeated the Philistines, he proved himself, but then he was on the run, and then now the king's dead. So what are we going to do? We need a king. So King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood, so why should you be the last to bring back the king and say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not commander of my army for life in place of Joab. He won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, return, you and all your men. Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. So the 10 tribes are basically saying like, hey, we want a king, and Judah, who has this divide now because Absalom was also from Judah and they anointed him. Yeah, he's the king in Judah and so, in Hebron. And so they have a bit of egg on their face because they had a dynasty split within their own tribe. And so David's message is like, listen, I'm hearing that the people of Israel want a king, but you don't. Now I am your flesh and blood. So why are you keeping me out? Why are you not welcoming me back? But then he also makes a political move to say, like, listen, Joab's done. He's not going to be general anymore. And instead I want Amasa, his other nephew, basically, to come and lead the troops. And so this is an olive branch of sorts to the people of Judah to say, like, look, I recognize, like, I need to make some compromises, and I'm not going to keep Joab in his current role. And so this is what brings them back together. Now, verse 15. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out to meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Gilgal is the place where the people of Israel crossed the Jordan with Joshua. And so this is a significant place for the history of the people of Israel. So they went out to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down to the men of Judah to meet King David. Now, Shimei was the one who cursed him as he was leaving. And so he's coming down to meet David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over to do whatever he wished. Now, these are all Benjamites. Now, who else is from the tribe of Benjamin? Saul, Michael, were you raising it? Yeah. Saul? Or you? Oh, you're from the tribe of Benjamin. All right. But Saul in this passage, like that's his tribe. And so this is, David took the throne after Saul died. And so here are the descendants in the tribe of Saul coming to him. That's not the descendants necessarily, but representatives of Saul's household coming and saying, hey, welcome, let me do whatever you want. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, may my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. So Abishai is Joab's brother, who's also pretty quick to say, that guy needs to die. So David replied, what does this have to do with you, you son of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? So the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king promised him on oath. Mephibosheth. So Shimei gets a pardon. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? Now remember, Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son. He is crippled in his feet, and Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, was supposed to take care of him. Ziba, when David is leaving, comes down to see David and say, I'm with you. I want to support you how best I can. And they're like, where's Mephibosheth? He's trying to make himself king. Here, though, we read Mephibosheth hadn't taken care of his feet or his mustache. So he's not trying, like what we're being told is he wasn't trying to make himself look kingly. Like he was abandoned. Like he was on his own. And as a person who can't walk, like this kind of care, like that's what Ziba was supposed to be doing for him. And so the writer of the scriptures telling us here, like Mephibosheth was not traveling to Jerusalem and trying to like pretty himself up to be next in line after the king shakedown. Mephibosheth said, my lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king, but you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? The king said to him, why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land. Mephibosheth said to the king, let him take everything now that my lord the king has returned home safely. So Mephibosheth, his concern here is not his inheritance. He's really is showing like, I want you, David, to be blessed. I am glad that you're alive. And I want you to know that I'm not trying to curse you and I'm not trying to get anything from you. I just want you, David, to be honored as the rightful king. And so Ziba, they're instructed to divide the land. Ziba should have been executed as well. But David is granting a pardon to him, granting a pardon to Mephibosheth. All the people who seem to be against him, he's pardoning as he is being lifted up into restoration to the throne in Jerusalem. Now Barzillai the Gileadite also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." But Barzillai answered the king, "How many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be added to an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance, but why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with you, my lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish." The king said, "Kimham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever you wish, and anything you desire from me, I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. So he's back in the land. I love Barzillai. He's like, "Look, I'm old. I don't need any fancy stuff in a palace. I just want to go die." Like, there's a point where it's like, I can't taste food. I can't hear music. Why go? So that's Barzillai. He's just a crotchety old man who's like, "I'm happy to help. Let me go back and just play solitaire on my computer." And so that's his life. But he passes on, like, "Look, you want to bless me, bless my descendant. Let him be at your table. Let him be a part of your entourage, because let him be the representative of Barzillai's generosity." And so David agrees to this. And so all the people welcome him back. Verse 41, and we'll wrap up after this section. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him with his household across the Jordan together with all his men?" And so, why did Judah get all this honor? Why couldn't we all come? Is basically what they're saying. And because Judah is David's tribe, and so there's favoritism afoot, and they're concerned about the appearance of favoritism. All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? What's your deal? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" Then the men of Israel answered the king of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king?" But the men of Judah pressed their claims even more forcefully than the men of Israel. So we'll stop there, because yes, David is back, coming to the throne, but there is dissension among the tribes. There's intra-tribal conflict, and this will carry on into the coming generations. And Solomon will unify the kingdom, but he will also press the kingdom pretty harshly in his expansion efforts. And when his son takes the throne, Rehoboam, the northern tribes are all like, "We have no shares in David. Go back to your tents." And so here, the northern tribes are like, "Hey, we have 10 claims to David. He's 10 of our tribe's kings, and you're just one tribe, Judah. So what are you doing? We should also be a part of the kingdom." So this is the tension that is going to carry on into the next generations. But yeah, David is going to spend the rest of his life dealing with ramifications from his sin with Bathsheba. And this is part of it now, the conflict in the kingdom. That's going to be continued on for hundreds of years. But it's also like when we read the book of Judges, we saw these different tribes were fighting with each other. Like the period of unity in Israel is very short. And it's very hard to maintain unity across large distances with different cultures and different tribes. And I mean, we see this all the time in the world, even now in our own country, the difference between Washington State and Louisiana. Like, that's a big difference. And a lot of it is, distance, but so much of it is just cultures and assumptions about one another. And part of the challenge, as followers of Jesus, we see this played out in Acts chapter 6, when the people are together, people from different cultures are coming together in the church, and the Jewish widows are being fed while the Grecian widows are not. And so they have to say, like, no, we're trying to build a new community here. And these are Jewish people just from different parts of the world. We're trying to build a community around Jesus, not around ethnic differences, cultural differences. And so even in churches now, like, the difference between, like, if people speak Spanish or English, but they're in the same community, they're like, can we be the same church around Jesus? It's very hard to maintain that kind of unity. And you have to be really intentional about it, to say, no, yeah, we all have different cultures, we all have different languages, but we want to be a part of what Jesus is doing. And so we see throughout Scripture, people have a really hard time unifying, but what God wants over and over again is to bring people together, and specifically around Jesus. So that's a different sermon for a different day. I should stop. So any questions on these chapters? I mean, it's a story that just keeps moving and moving and moving. But yeah, any questions, folks online? Michael's got a question. What's up? What's that? That's coming up. Can I spoil it right now? All right, Joab, when David is about to die and Solomon is coming up to be king, David says, hey, make sure Joab doesn't die in peace. And Joab is executed. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty intense. So yeah, he was ruthless. And part of it is, like, David's motivation with telling Solomon to do that is, like, Joab brought a lot of this pain into my life with Absalom, and he killed Abner. I didn't tell him to do that, but he did it. He killed Absalom, like, even though, like, that pain was something that Joab brought in my life, thinking he was going to bring peace, but then he also then killed him. Joab's a bad dude. So yeah. But yeah, it's a good question, because, like, there's so much history and so many things happening over all these different chapters, like, that's being able to cover it all in one night. Like, my hope is that we keep saying, like, come back next week, come back next week. So, because there's more to tell. And I love the Old Testament because I love history, and I love a good story. And so much of the Old Testament is these stories that, just show, like, God orchestrating things in a way that maybe we wouldn't plan it, but then also consequences of human brokenness. Like, all of that is all in the Old Testament, all over the place. So yeah, any other questions, thoughts? None in the room. Anyone online? Any questions? All right. Well then, let's wrap there. I'll pray, and then we will head out to the rest of our Wednesday. It's getting shorter as the time goes on. Lord, we thank you for your providence, and we thank you for examples in Scripture that we can learn from, positive and negative. Lord, how we can trust you, but also when we recognize the characters in Scripture that we should not try to emulate. But Lord, I pray that you would help us to be gracious to our enemies, like David was in these few passages. We also pray, Lord, that you'd help us to be generous to people in need, like Barzillai. We pray that you would help us to be people of truth and integrity, and help us to learn what it is to be unified around your purposes in the world, and as a church and followers of Jesus, connected across churches and different communities as well. So help us to unify around your gospel for your glory, Lord. Amen. Amen. All right, everyone, have a good night.